This is part 10 of the I Own an Abandoned Motel series. If you haven't and would like to check out the rest, a link to the playlist is in the description below. I own an abandoned motel, and if you find a shrine made of bones, run in the other direction. Written by Wine Dark Sea, 1239. That can't be, I said, voice catching in my throat. The man who calls himself Jake Hubert sat dejectedly at the edge of the old bed. He certainly would be the right age, having disappeared in the summer of 1999 at age 20. I didn't really remember him from that summer, although he had been the one to give my mother the key to the wet lady's cottage. It was because of him that I nearly drowned as a child, that my nights were haunted by empty eye sockets and dripping, rotting fingers. I remembered the hurt in Martina's voice as she spoke of her guilt, that for a moment she had averted her attention from the motel, and because of it, a college kid had died. As the shock of his revelation began to fade, anger welled up in its place. 20 years? I said, my voice rising in volume. It's been over 20 years, and you couldn't tell Martina that you were alive? You had to screw with her, with the beer and the cigarettes? He ran his fingers through his graying hair and clenched his fists in frustration. I couldn't, he said, as though the words were difficult for him. In the old tales, Renee said, appearing at my side, the Lugaroo could tell no one of his curse. Is that true, Mr. Hubert? Jake stared at his feet, his face inscrutable. He looked at Renee and then to me. He nodded slowly. I didn't want to hurt Martina. When did you meet her? Renee asked. Martina, No. Renee interrupted. Her. Jake became agitated. I can't talk about that. We saw the shrine. I know you were in her thrall, but we need you to talk to us. I think you owe Nora that, at least. He shook his head and rummaged under the dirty flannel blankets covering the bed. He retrieved a carton of cigarettes and shoved them in his back pocket. I don't owe you people anything, he spat. He left the cabin, leaving the shoddily constructed door swinging behind. Renee started after him, but I grabbed his arm. Let me go, I said. You still have the silver, right? He hesitated, not quite in agreement with my plan. After a couple of moments, he handed me the bangles, which were in desperate need of cleaning. I'll be nearby, he said. I found Jake in the back of the cabin, sitting at a weathered picnic table, smoking a cigarette. Mind if I join you? I asked tentatively. He made a grunt of assent. We sat there in silence for a while. I met you when you were a little kid, he said quietly. A long time ago. Has it really been 20 years? I nodded. Almost 24, actually. He took another drag of his cigarette, eyes fixed on nothing. Well, shit. Yeah? More silence. He was clearly not used to human conversation. I'm going to die within the year, I said softly. I saw the head in the fog. He sat up straighter, eyebrows knitted in concern. What do you want from me then? Go live your life while you have it. And if you want my advice, ditch the dead guy. He scowled at a spot in the distance where he undoubtedly could sense Renee. He's helping me. The motel is mine now. My Uncle Jim is dead. My dad is dead. Martina is dead. A look of sadness crossed his face. Martina and Jim? Dead? I nodded. It's just me. And I don't have much time. The entities at the motel are becoming more aggressive. Entities, huh? You mean like me? Yes. That's why I need you to talk to me. He shuddered. I can't. You heard your boyfriend. Part of the curse. I chuckled embarrassedly. He's not my boyfriend. Ever think that maybe he can help you? Earlier we stumbled across that bone thing. Renee called it a shrine. I heard it call to me, beckoning me to touch it, to lie down before it. I couldn't stop myself until Renee did his vampire mind thing and broke the enchantment. Maybe he could do that for you. You heard the shrine? He asked apprehensively. It called to you, and you were able to resist? Only after Renee intervened. I suppose I can let him try, he said reluctantly, stamping out a cigarette on the table. Thank you, Jake. Thank you. I waved my hand in the general direction, where I suspected Renee was listening, and he appeared in an instant. Jake rolled his eyes. Okay, this little supernatural species alpha male feud ends right now. Do you both understand me? Jake chuckled dryly. Fine. Renee continued to scowl at the werewolf. Renee? He nodded. Very well, he said. Do you think you can try and undo whatever enchantment prevents him from talking? I can certainly try. It might be unpleasant, but if Hubert here is willing. I'll do it for the kid, Jake said gruffly. Thank you, I said. Renee sat down next to Jake and lifted his chin so that he was facing him directly. Jake emitted a low growl. Relax, Renee commanded. Jake's face slackened and at once appeared almost peaceful. Look at me. They locked eyes. A minute passed, maybe two. I noticed Jake's eyes began to twitch. His mouth opened and closed. Renee was concentrating deeply, his jaw clenched. Jake tried to jerk his head away with a groan, but Renee brought his hands to the side of his face and turned him back. From head to toe, his body began to shake with escalating severity. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he let out a blood-curdling cry. Both men were thrown to the frozen grass as if punished by an unseen force. I rushed over to where they lay. Renee groaned but sat up, his face slightly gaunt with exertion. Jake panted on the ground, his eyes closed, his breath ragged. He blinked his eyes open, but he still appeared dazed. Renee helped him up and sat him back on the picnic table bench. Are you okay? I asked. I don't know, Jake said. She's in very deep, Renee said, voice wary. But I may have been able to peel away at least some of her influence. Jake retrieved his lighter from his jeans pocket and took out another cigarette. He offered the carton to Renee. Renee took it, a smile of surprise crossing his face. Jake lit his and handed the lighter to Renee. Thanks, Renee said. I needed this. He offered the carton to me, but I shook my head. Try saying something simple, Jake, I asked. Just say, I'm a werewolf. He took a deep breath. Here it goes. I'm a werewolf. His face broke out into a smile, a true smile for the first time. Renee sighed in relief. I don't know how far this goes, but I feel lighter somehow. The weight in my chest, it's not as heavy. I'm going to try talking now. You're going to have to forgive me if sometimes I can't find the words. It's been a while since, well, I understand, Jake. It's okay. It all started that summer in 1999 when the pool I had been lifeguarding at decided to close early. She had got hurt or something. Liability, maybe? I can't remember. I thought I could get back some of that lost summer income before going back to Clarkson, so I started asking around. The gas station needed an extra guy for a bit, so I was going to go with that until my dad came home one day, said his buddy from high school owned a motel and needed someone to help out while his manager was out of town for a family emergency. Pay was triple what the gas station was offering. I didn't think twice. My dad told him I was interested. Jim Collin came over to chat with me, and I still remember sitting with him on the deck, sun beating down on us. He had been friendly when he introduced himself, but when we sat down to talk, he got real serious. He asked me if I believed in ghosts. I was surprised. It didn't seem like he was pulling my leg at all, so I told him that we had a ghost right there in our house. When I was a little kid, I would lay in bed at night and knock on the wall behind me. There always would be a knock back, even though there was nothing on the other side of the wall. I'd hear footsteps going up and down the stairs. One time, when I was 16, I opened the bathroom door to find an old lady in a hospital gown staring back at me with cloudy, dead eyes. Turns out an old lady died in the house before we moved in. She was never malevolent. In fact, she always struck me as the kind grandmotherly type, looking out for me, you know? Jim seemed pleased to hear that. He told me that the motel was haunted too, but that the things there were a bit more difficult to deal with. He said if I was still up for it, I could meet with his manager. It sounded cool to me, and the pay was incredible. So, I met Martina. Martina is, I guess was, his voice faltered. A tour de force, I added, my eyes brimming with tears. He chuckled. Yeah. She was. She gave me a lot of tough love, but I needed it. Anyway, I had just finished a couple days of training with Martina at Collin's when I met a girl. I was picking up some eggs at a convenience store when she came up to me asking for a light. She looked about my age. She had highlights in her hair, and she wore this black spaghetti strap tank top and this pair of cool metallic cargo pants. Just a gorgeous girl. I just couldn't stop staring at her eyes. They were green and just magnetic. She was really easy to talk to, too. She didn't seem to mind my awkwardness at all. We talked about school. She told me she was doing engineering at Clarkson, too, which I found a bit odd since I had never seen her in any of my classes, and I would have certainly remembered her. She made some excuse about studying abroad in France or something, but honestly, I would have forgiven her for anything at that point. She told me that her name was Kate, and when she gave me her number, I thought I was in love with her. I tried to pay attention to Martina. I tried to study the notebook. I really did. But then I'd think of Kate, and all was lost. She wanted to spend time with me. A lot of time. Anytime I wasn't at the motel, I had to be with her. My parents didn't care much. They thought it was great I had a girlfriend. Kate would find these romantic, clandestine places where we would make love. It was thrilling and all-consuming, and I didn't care that everything else in my life seemed to be slipping away. By the time Martina left, it wasn't enough for me to just see her after work. We needed to be together all day. When she wasn't with me, I felt empty, almost lightheaded, like I couldn't focus. I remember the day you came in with your mom. I tried to pull myself together for Jim's sister-in-law, but all I could think of was Kate coming back with a six-pack, wondering which room we could use for the night. You gave my mom the wrong key. I almost died. His face fell, the old shame rushing back to him. I'm so sorry, Nora. You were just a kid. So were you, Jake. So were you. He smiled sadly. I did the payment for that fish lady. Marbles, a perch. I remember that clearly. Scary looking fucker. But I felt so brave, so masculine. I couldn't wait to brag about it to Kate. I told her about everything at the motel. I should have been alarmed that she barely reacted. No normal person would listen to all that and not at least call me nuts. She just smiled and nodded, complimenting me, telling me how incredible I was. Renee laughed mirthlessly. She knows what men love to hear. Jake gave him a look of surprise, then understanding. He nodded and continued. By the night of the full moon, we were pretty much living at the motel. I called home occasionally, lied to my parents about how busy the job was, and how I would just crash in a vacant room after my shift. Kate and I would take turns getting beer, pizza, and cigarettes. I read the notebook entry for Cottage 13 with her on my lap. This one is really easy, I told her. She watched me with a huge grin on her face as I dragged the deer carcass to the cottage door. By sunset, I had already consumed an entire six-pack of beer by myself. We were lying in a bed in the motel, naked together, when I began to hear the howling. Kate didn't flinch. In fact, she looked a little bored. And this howling, well, you know, right? A normal person would have been alarmed. She turned over to face me and had this weird look in her eyes. Can't you shut that thing up? What? We're supposed to stay inside. I can't stand that sound. Can't you just take the gun the old lady keeps in the safe and take care of it? Didn't she give you the combination? Yeah, but it's not like that's a stray dog out there. She pursed her lips with disappointment, which filled me with panic. The thought of making her unhappy, even for a moment, made me want to vomit. If you're too scared, it's okay, she said with a smirk. I'm not scared. Then what are you waiting for? Her face was defiant, but calm, though I noticed her nostrils flared in annoyance. I reached for a half-empty can of beer on the nightstand and drained it in one gulp. Fine, I'll go. She smiled in a way that freaked me out, but I was too elated that she was happy with me again to care. I didn't know anything about guns except for the basic orientation Martina had given me. I opened the safe and at least had the sense to grab that silver. By the time I got out there, the howling had stopped, and I started feeling hopeful I could return to Kate and tell her that the thing was gone. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. I walked around the property, gun loaded and ready. Occasionally, I would come across a piece of the deer, a leg here, an ear there. As I bent down to examine them, I began to have the suspicion that I was being watched. I could hear panting coming from somewhere around me, like that of a large dog. The wolf leapt out of seemingly nowhere and pinned me to the ground, burying its teeth into my shoulder. I could hear it hit the bone in its frenzy. I managed to free my hand underneath its belly and pushed the silver into it with all my might. It howled in pain and removed its jaw from my shoulder, allowing me to drag myself away momentarily. With my my good arm, I grasped the gun that had fallen in the attack and aimed, balancing against my other arm, which was completely numb from my wound. I fired and somehow managed to hit it, just under the neck. I was frozen in shock, watching the thing gasp and sputter in pain. My own wound, so horrifying, I felt like I wasn't in my own body anymore. The werewolf shuddered, and its sounds became more haggard, slower. The limbs shrunk down to human arms and legs. The face was now that of a man's, beard and hair as white as moonlight. He must have been in his late 60s, perhaps early 70s. He coughed blood and stared at me with a mad look in his eyes. Just as I felt I was about to lose consciousness, I saw a familiar figure standing between me and the old werewolf. It was Kate, but not as I knew her. She was draped in a gauzy black robe. Her hair no longer had fake orange highlights, but fell to her knees in dark, silky waves. Her stare was terrible. It's hard to describe. So terrible and beautiful. I wanted to gouge out my own eyes. She was smiling, but it wasn't the smile I knew. She smiled with black teeth. She threw her head back and laughed with a black tongue. The old man cried out and reached for her. Please, please, save me, my beloved, my only object of worship. He wept. She looked at him with disgust. She began to walk towards me. Under her bare feet, the grass scorched and withered. Good boy, Jake, she said with that terrible smile. She bent down and caressed my cheek, patted my hair. She took the gun out of my hands. With a cruel laugh, she aimed at the old man, still sobbing and begging her with a weak voice. She pulled the trigger, and his head flew backwards. He fell to the ground, dead. I was too terrified to scream. Kate tossed the gun to the grass. She observed me trembling at her feet and raised her hand into a fist. Despite my weakness, despite my gaping wound, my body rose into a kneeling position. She placed a palm over my forehead and pressed down. My body exploded into a fiery pain. The wound on my shoulder healed, but my skin felt hot to the touch, as though I were suffering from a high fever. It began to itch, as though from the inside, and I clawed at myself for relief. My bones felt as though someone was tearing them from their ligaments and rearranging them at will. Now, I screamed. I screamed and screamed until my scream wasn't a scream at all anymore. It was the howl of a wolf, of something unnatural. She laughed as though nothing in the world delighted her more than my suffering. I was panting at her feet, no longer human. She stroked my fur with pleasure and produced what looked like a silver collar. The cries that escaped me when she clamped it around my neck were even more awful. One must always carefully train new pets, lest they disobey their masters. Isn't that right, my little wolf? Will you be a good dog? My senses were addled by the pain and the effect of my transformation. In that form, I could not think as a man, but as an animal. I tried to nod my head in assent. She removed the collar, but before I could recover, I felt as though I had been swept up in a swirling vortex. We were hurtling through the sky, she and I, her robe whipping around her, her body reveling in the moonlight. A dark mist bore us away, at times disturbed by faces of apparitions in agony, ghostly men and women begging in plaintive voices in every language. I found myself here on this island, a man once more. Kate stood before me, dressed as she once did when I thought she was a human girl, a mocking smile on her face. We were in the clearing. You know the one. I was naked, shivering in front of that thing, the Tower of Bones. "This is your home now, dog," she said, her voice like the hissing of a snake in my ears. She told me the terms of my service to her. On the full moon, I would transform. If it was anywhere else besides the Cullen property, she would punish me. If I tried to run away, she would punish me. If I did not cut my hand every night at sunset and place it on the Shrine of Bones, she would punish me. For that was how she knew I was where I was supposed to be. "I will bind your tongue so that you may not utter a word of your curse to anyone. Even if you dare to approach your friends, your family, I will put them down as easily as I did that useless man. Do you understand, you miserable creature?" I nodded. What else should I do? With that, she was gone, and I was alone. I found the old man's cottage, slept in his bed. I realized the only food I could consume was raw meat. During the days, I would take the old man's boat and haunt the dumpsters of grocery stores, stealing the discarded meat. On that first full moon, I returned to Cullen's. Almost as soon as I stepped foot on the property, the transformation took place. Even more painful and agonizing than the one before. As grateful as a beast should be. I tried to think of my family, but could focus on nothing with the mind of the wolf. Then I remembered Martina, and even in that state, I could still feel guilt. Just before sunrise, as the animal began to recede within me, I tore a piece of wax paper from the deer carcass and tried to write in blood. I tried to write what happened to me, but Kate had been right. I could not. I thought I had a clever solution. I thought that surely this was a way she could understand that it was me, that I wasn't dead. I wrote asking for smokes and Labatt's, and at every full moon thereafter, they were there. But now, you say that Martina did not understand, that all this time she thought I was mocking her. That saddens me greatly. Sometimes she comes for me, this being I once knew as Kate. She transforms me, and I travel with her as her dog. Now, I simply know her as the mistress. Jake hung his head in his hands, and I knew he had finished his story. Renee sat with his arms folded, likely consumed by his own memories. "What happened on that last full moon, Jake?" I asked. "Why did you try to lure me out?" "I didn't. I don't have that kind of power. But that night was different from the others. I felt almost possessed by rage, like I had to get at whatever was inside of that cottage, as though my life depended on it." "It was she who lured you, Nora," Renee said. "I would not be surprised if all the late attempts on your life had been at her behest and under her power." "Why doesn't she just do it herself? Why bother?" "Where would the fun be in that?" Jake said bitterly. I turned to Renee, but he was looking into the thick growth of trees. The color drained from Jake's face, and he rose, facing the same direction as Renee. Then I began to hear it too, a creaking sound followed by a sickening thud, as though something was approaching. I spotted a large white figure through the trees. The creaking was a sound of hundreds of bones bending and cracking, held together by thick roots that laced the thing like veins. Renee turned to us. "Run to the boat." Before I could react, a giant root thrust its way through the wooden picnic table at which we had just been sitting moments ago. Renee grabbed my arm and we began to run. A root grabbed my ankle and I fell hard against the frozen ground, knocking the wind out of me. Renee tried to tear at it, but it was too strong. He fumbled in his jacket and took out a pocket knife. But before he could pierce the root, I saw him lift it away from me. I turned my body as much as I could and saw the shrine of bone before us. Eyes of the skull of the stag that crowned it, illuminated with a green glow. The roots were its limbs, and Renee struggled before it, suspended in its clutches. Jake tried to free me as well, with about as much success as Renee. The thing before us began to pulse with a soundless energy, and my body erupted in pain. It felt as though my internal organs were about to burst. The pressure was so great. I could see the energy affected Renee and Jake as well. Jake fell to the ground, writhing in pain, and I noticed that his arms began to lengthen. His hands were becoming the claws of the beast once more. "Jake," I screamed, "you have to resist." I noticed that his lighter had fallen out of his jeans pocket, and an idea occurred to me. With all my strength, I stretched my arms in its direction. The root at my ankle began to squeeze. The lighter was just beyond my finger. I could barely touch the bottom. I steeled myself, knowing that if I panicked, I could flick it away even further. The pain was increasing, but I took a deep breath, clenching my teeth, tears streaming down my face. I was able to lock onto the lighter with 2 fingers and brought it into the palm of my hand. It took all of my remaining strength to sit up and set the root that held me aflame. It ignited immediately. The thing moaned with a terrible cry. I watched as the flames snaked their way through the roots that held it together as though it were doused in gasoline. The pulsing energy had stopped, and I turned to Jake, who was now able to stop his transformation. The flames shot out over the roots holding Renee, hitting him with a giant fireball before releasing him. With a cry, I realized that he was on fire. As the bone shrine collapsed around us, I ran to him. I tore off my coat and tried to snuff out the flames, Jake kicking dirt over them. Finally, the fire had been extinguished, but a significant amount of Renee's body from his chest downward had been charred. I waited for his body to start healing, but the process appeared to be much slower than for a flesh wound. "We need to get back to the boat," Renee gasped. Jake lifted him over his shoulder, and we ran the rest of the way. He lowered Renee carefully down, and I jumped in, grabbing the thermos he had left inside and bringing it to his lips. As Renee drank gratefully, Jake undid the mooring and began to paddle. Just as the first signs of sunrise appeared in the sky, we arrived back at the motel. A vampire, a werewolf, and a girl doomed to die, wondering what we had just done.